For 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I first want to say a heartfelt thank you to Capitol Police and Metro Police for the jobs that you do. I come from a state that we respect law enforcement and we abide by the letter of the law. And every week that I get on a plane and I fly to DC, my husband wonders if something is going to happen to me while I am here, working, serving the people of Oklahoma's 5th Congressional District. It is absolutely infuriating to me what is happening to the nation's capital right now. People call my office excited to come this summer to tour the monuments, to bring their children. And one of the questions they're asking my office is, can you tell me about safety? Why in the world do we have to have a conversation with visitors to the U.S. Capitol, the heart of this country? We have to worry about safety. It's just appalling. And I think it should be noted, the majority of the members have been popping in and out, but we haven't seen the majority of the Democrat side attend this hearing, nor did they offer up a Dem witness to be able to ask questions to. As my colleague, Dr. Murphy mentioned, this isn't a partisan issue. This is a safety issue. And it was brought up at the beginning of this hearing by the ranking member. There was a discussion about gun violence. This isn't a gun violence discussion. This is a prosecute the crimes that the individuals are committing in this city problem. And it was referenced that we are arresting young people under the age of 24 and not prosecuting them. The DC City Council and the mayor of DC should be held fully accountable for the crime that's happening in this city. It's infuriating to me. Chief, I want to start with you. How is the USCP trying to, suppress or deter crime in the Capitol Hill area?
So we have the advantage of having a much smaller jurisdiction than other police departments, but as I've said, we certainly understand that we can be of service and we can be of help to the neighborhoods in and around Capitol Hill. We respond to calls that we hear come out in this area, and I think it's important that we work in partnership with MPD to help them, and but I talk all the time about us being a protection agency, which we are, but we cannot ever walk away from our police responsibilities. We're still cops, and we still fight crime. And on this campus, if you took the crime rate of things that happen on this campus, it's very low. There's not a lot of crime on this campus. Not non-existent, but there's not a lot. So to the extent that we can push that out to the surrounding neighborhoods, certainly push it out where we have congressional events. We're going to continue to do that. So it's just understanding that we need to continue to take our police responsibilities very seriously.
It was mentioned by a couple of my colleagues that we have a 50-year low for the number of officers on the MPD currently. Is your USCP trying to help augment some of the 500 police officer shortage that the MPD is seeing currently?
To the extent we can, absolutely, especially in the area where we're patrolling. And so we would offer them the help the same way they offer us help every day of the week. So yeah, we're doing our best to work hand in hand with them. Yes.
If I can also just ask, what do you think that proactive measures that can be taken by either members or staff to try to protect the safety of people in and around the Capitol? What should we be doing?
So we offer a fair number of services in terms of escorts, in terms of what we call law enforcement coordinations, and it still frustrates me that the participation rate, the request rate for those services is very low. So just encouraging your colleagues, encouraging staff members, encouraging, at any event that you all might have to let us know so that we can help either coordinate with the state and locals who are in the jurisdiction, or we can be there ourselves.
The last thing I think I want to read, which I think really gets to the heart of the problem, it has to do with some of the police reforms that have come forward. And I would say that DC isn't prosecuting the crimes, not just these individuals that are being classified as youth that are under 24, but a myriad of other crimes as well. There were over 15,000 crimes committed, according to the report that I have in front of me, but more than 10,000 were not actually prosecuted. And I think that's part of the problem. Maybe the DC City Council should look at changing their statutes to allow for an elected DA to be able to hold a DA accountable. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields back. The gentleman from the state of Ohio, Mr. Carey, is now recognized.
I want to thank the chairman and also the ranking member for having this hearing today. I do want to point out a couple of things. I happen to be one of those members that actually lives in a neighborhood very similar to Capitol Hill in Columbus, Ohio, and you know, so we have seen the uptick, of course, and I've talked to our police officers there, and the recruiting efforts that they are facing is equal to what I think is consistent with what I'm seeing across the country. I also do want to point out that, you know, when you reach a certain age, a lot of your staff tend to be about the same age as your children, and we had 3 of our young staffers that were just walking back on Capitol Hill. One of them is here with us today, that were attacked by a homeless guy with a knife. And, you know, as a father, you hear that, and you view these young staffers as professionals, but you're mindful. So anyway, along those lines, I do have a few questions. Chief, I'd like to kind of start with you. As we know, the Capitol Police expanded jurisdiction reaches beyond the Capitol campus itself into some of those surrounding neighborhoods. And you mentioned this in your written testimony. You also highlighted it. And you described some of the multiple incidences that you've responded to in the crimes in the nearby area. What are the greatest challenges that you face with the jurisdiction of these neighborhoods?
The biggest challenge for us is that once you get beyond that extended jurisdiction zone, and you know, and oftentimes we're patrolling beyond there because we've got a building where 30 members of Congress live, so we're patrolling that 3, 4, 5 times a night. The fact that if something happens, oftentimes we'd have to call for MPD to take some sort of action because we don't have the authority that we need.
Well, with that, what would you say the coordination with MPD? What's that typically like?
It's great, but a very quick example. We had at the congressional softball game last year. It was beyond our extended jurisdiction zone. We had a group of demonstrators walk on into center field and stop the game. We called for MPD because we did not have the authority to arrest them because it was outside the extended jurisdiction zone. What I would like is to have a memorandum of agreement. We have several memorandums of agreement with MPD to be able to, at a congressional event, that we would in fact have the authority to take police action at something like that. So we wouldn't have to wait for them to make the arrests.
And I appreciate that. It was something else, and like I mentioned, you know, I live in a neighborhood very similar to Capitol Hill. It's in the city of Columbus, and of course, many members do across the country. And so, Chief, can you describe how the Capitol Police work with our local law enforcement agencies nationwide to ensure member security in our own districts?
I appreciate that question. We have dozens, and that number is growing exponentially, dozens of memorandums of agreement that have been signed with state and local police departments from around the country so that we can request their assistance and they will provide that assistance for an event in a member's home district so that they will provide additional security, and we'll reimburse them for any cost of that assistance. So we work very well with state and local agencies from around the country, and as you may know, we have nationwide jurisdiction to investigate threats against members of Congress. But the fact is, we don't have the staffing to investigate, you know, to go all over the country to do something. So we work with state and locals, and we have great relationships all over the country.
Lastly, and I only have a minute left, how many arrests does the Capitol Police make in a typical week from DUIs or other criminal suspects coming from D.C. into the nearby campuses?
You know, traffic offenses, including DUIs, we probably make a dozen or so every week. But I will tell you that the number of arrests over the last couple of years has gone up each year.
Yeah. And as somebody who was a staffer here in the 1990s, I can tell you it's definitely changed. in many ways for the better, but obviously we're seeing this uptick. Really appreciate your testimony, and I appreciate the work that you do with our local security teams. I know we have a person on our staff that coordinates with you guys, and you guys have done a fantastic job, and I appreciate that. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. A former law enforcement officer, Mr. D'Esposito, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here today. And this is rare, but I have to disagree with my colleagues when they say that this isn't partisan. This is actually, in fact, partisan, because Democrats and their legislation has created this issue, whether it's here in Washington, D.C., in our nation's capital, or if it's home in New York. They have passed and promoted pro-criminal, anti-law enforcement legislation that has led us to this situation. Law enforcement officers actually wear handcuffs on their gun belts to use them against criminals. But Democrats in places like New York and Washington, D.C., have allowed those handcuffs to be put on us to not do our jobs. And I know that in the beginning of the hearing, we heard that the beginning of this year, it seems that crime is down in Washington, D.C., and Chief Manger, Mr. Pemberton, you guys have been in law enforcement for how many years?
45.
45?
19.
19, that's 64. We'll add mine in, let's say, almost 80 years. All right, 80 years on the job. What season do we usually see the least amount of crime committed, especially those on the street? Probably be the winter, right? When the weather gets nicer, crime tends to spike. Okay. So now, I know that we also talked about guns. One of the issues that we're facing with guns throughout this country is that people are getting arrested with illegal firearms, and they're not getting prosecuted. We see guns being taken off the streets, but very often the criminals who tote those firearms are able to walk the streets freely again before the cops are actually done with their paperwork. Now, Mr. Pemberton, I know that you were in the violent crime unit, similar to the work that I did. If you had to take a guess, an estimation, how many firearms, how many guns gun arrests have you been a part of in your career?
I would have to say over 1,000.
Okay. My number's probably a little less. You have some more time on the job. My next question is this. Out of the over 1,000 gun arrests that you were part of, how many of those individuals, when you went to arrest them, presented you with a license to carry that gun?
0.
So gun licensing really would have nothing to do with the carrying of firearms, because those who are breaking the law really don't care about what gun laws are, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Now, in all of the guns that you have recovered, I guess we should focus more recently here in Washington, D.C., because it seems like the other side of the aisle wants to talk about assault weapons. They want to talk about high-capacity firearms, when, in fact, much of the time, the people who speak the most, and I'm not talking about Mr. Morelli at all, I have great respect for him, but there are people who love to speak about high-capacity weapons. They love to talk about guns that are in mass shootings. But in fact, they really don't know much about firearms, and they don't even know about the guns that they're speaking of. So in the arrests that have been made by the MPD, how many of the guns over the last year would have been handguns? You could give an estimate. I'm sure you don't have the number off the top of your head.
Yeah, I don't. I know that last year we recovered like 3,200 firearms. I don't know how many were handguns, but I would venture a guess that it was at least 90%.
So 90% of the guns recovered last year in Washington, D.C. You said 3,200 were recovered, so 90% of them were handguns, illegal firearms, and not one of those people probably presented a license to carry it.
I think that's fair, yes.
Okay. And a lot of those individuals were repeat offenders, right? They've been arrested, they've been part of the criminal justice system. Why? Because over the last few years, legislation implemented by Democrats throughout this country has made this country less safe. It's a fact. And Mr. Manguel, I know that you mentioned in your opening statement about the dwindling number of police officers. Why do you think we have a dwindling number of police officers?
I think a lot of it has to do with the rhetoric and the environment that's been created by policy, and I have some personal experience with this.
Exactly right. It's the rhetoric and it's the policy that's been created. It's the rhetoric that is being spewed by Democrats here on Capitol Hill, by anti-cop people throughout this country, and it's the policies, not only policy, because now we're talking about laws, actually things that are on the books. People took pens, put them to paper, and passed legislation to make this country less safe, to make the jobs of law enforcement harder, and to give criminals free rein to do whatever it is they want without any repercussions. It's why, right here on Capitol Hill, you can't go to CVS and get batteries because they're locked up. Why? Because people go into stores, take whatever they want, and walk right out. That is the country. That is the city that Democrats have created. And I blame it, and I say it's partisan, because they're the ones who have carried this banner. They're the ones who have passed this legislation, and they're the ones who have doubled down and said, we're going to continue to do this. My time has expired, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Ms. Lee is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses who have joined us here today for your important testimony and also your efforts to fight crime, to fight violent crime, and your work to ensure that those who live and visit our nation's capital can do so in a way that is safe. I would also like to discuss today a program with the Capitol Police, Chief Manger, the Special Assistant United States Attorney Program, and how that is a program that you are utilizing to actually help ensure that you are keeping members of Congress, other government officials, and the public safe. Would you please describe for us the Special Assistant United States Attorney, or SALSA, program that you are using in field offices in Tampa, Sacramento, and D.C.?
So these, DOJ has provided us with the authorization to have these SALSAs to prosecute cases nationwide and to assist in prosecuting threats against involving members of Congress. The Department of Justice has also designated our SALSAs as subject matter experts on threats cases. We've had great success with them. Our SALSA in Tampa has worked multiple cases in the Middle District of Florida, leading to guilty pleas and threat cases involving a threat against a member of Congress, other federal officials, and in one case, a threat against a Supreme Court justice. We've had, again, great success. The SALSA in D.C., their primary portfolio includes managing the threat portal for U.S. Attorney's Office and the District of Columbia. A number of cases involving members of Congress as victims, congressional staff members as victims, or crimes that occurred on Capitol grounds. We have our own prosecutor that makes sure those cases go forward.
Do you foresee, or would you hope to see, an expansion of the SALSA program into additional cities across America?
I think as the workload it presents itself, that it's a very efficient way for us to handle a lot of these cases, so that not every investigator, not every attorney is flying out from D.C. We've got folks around the country that can be on the scene working these cases.
And could you describe, I believe the SALSAs also provide training to case agents and investigators within the threat assessment section. Could you describe for us that section and how the SALSAs are working to help train case agents and investigators?
They are the subject matter experts on threat cases. And we get, and as everybody here knows, you get threats and concerning calls and directions of interest that are very concerning. And these attorneys train our officers to know when it crosses that line from being just free speech or being just something concerning to something that is a criminal threat.
And in your assessment, has the program as implemented thus far been successful in addressing some of the rise in threats against members in Congress?
Absolutely. We have better success in terms of prosecution now than we did before we had this program.
And can you tell us why you think that changed, why that better rate of success is happening?
I think it's because this is their primary job. You know, prior to this, we were competing with attorneys that had a huge caseload, and you know, sometimes they just looked at our case and said, okay, you know, not sure this is going to rise to the level of being a priority for, you know, for me, because I'm prosecuting much more serious cases. This way we have folks that their priority is, working threats against members of Congress.
Thank you, Chief. And Mr. Mangual, last fall, the Committee on House Administration held a briefing for members and staff regarding the rise in crime in Washington, D.C. It included safety tips and advice for how best to protect oneself against carjackings and the proliferation of other things like assaults and robberies that we've been seeing here in the district. Would you like to provide any additional insight or advice on how residents or visitors to our nation's capital can protect themselves from these types of violent crimes?
So unfortunately, I can't say that I have any expertise in terms of giving advice on personal security, but the one piece of advice that I would give residents is to urge their policymakers and their representatives in the D.C. Council and in Congress to push harder on anti-crime measures. As I mentioned in my testimony, it's very, very clear that the criminal justice system's capability of dealing with repeat offenders has been eroded. And it's been eroded for quite some time. And that's why you see the most heinous crimes consistently committed by people who have 10, 15, 20, 30 prior arrests. To my mind, one of the most effective uses of time that citizens can make with respect to this issue is putting pressure on their elected officials to make some changes and stop that problem where it is.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields back. We're in the home stretch here of our hearing, but I'd like to recognize the ranking member for brief closing remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and again, thank you all for being here. This is a complicated and nuanced issue, no doubt, and more resources would clearly be helpful. I want to, Ms. Lee, point out an interesting point as relates to the U.S. attorneys, which is again why I'm so strongly opposed to the proposed $320 million cut that was proposed by House Republicans for U.S. attorneys who do great work all across this country, including prosecuting crimes here in Washington, D.C. I did, and I'm sorry that Mr. D'Esposito left, but since he raised a couple of things. First, as it related to 2024 crime statistics, he talked about seasonality. I was actually comparing the same period of time of year from January 1 to March 21st. So basic statistics, you want to compare like things, and that's what I did. So I understand there will be seasonal adjustments. But he raised another thing, which he said this was a partisan issue and basically condemned Democrats and blamed us for the crime issue. I wasn't going to raise this, but I am going to now, which is violent crime, as I said, in D.C., is obviously of concern to all of us. But I note, according to a study by Third Way that looked at 21 years of crime data, at the peak of the violent crime spike in 2020, murder rates were 40% higher in red states, defined as states that voted for former President Trump in 2020, as opposed to blue states, defined as those states that voted for Joe Biden in 2020. The murder rate in states that voted for Donald Trump exceeded the murder rate in the states that voted for Joe Biden every year for 2 decades, from 2000 to 2020. Over the course of those 21 years, the per capita murder rate in Trump states was 23% higher than the murder rate in Biden states. Even if you remove murders in the largest cities in red states from the equation, those dominated by Democrats, murder rates in Trump voting states were 12% higher across the 21-year period than Biden states, which included those Democratic-controlled areas. I ask unanimous consent to enter this study entitled "The 2-Decade Red State Murder Problem" into the record. And I would say again,
Without objection.
this is nuanced. And look, I have strongly, as a Democrat, supported more resources for law enforcement. I will continue to do that. And I believe we should have zero tolerance for crime in general. So I don't disagree with many of the comments made about prosecution. But it is impossible to look at the crime problem in the United States without looking at gun safety measures that are common sense. We have 400 million guns in the United States today. That's more than a single gun for every man, woman, and child in the United States. I have a family of hunters and people who take this very seriously, and most people do take gun violence seriously and gun safety. But we have a problem, and not to acknowledge it and to suggest that the only reason that we have problems because Democrats in urban areas, I think, is just irresponsible, and I think is beneath the really learned approach that needs to be taken by the Congress in addressing these problems. But again, thank you for the hearing, Mr. Chair. Thank you again to the witnesses for your service, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back, and I thank you for your attendance. I'll note, if we're debating if this is a partisan issue, I think it's telling one Democrat showed up willing to defend the soft on crime policies of the D.C. City Council. The rest of the entire Democrats on this committee ducked out. Why? because it's pretty darn tough to defend a 24-year-old male who uses a gun to carjack someone being treated as a youth. And that's the policy here in our nation's capital because of soft on crime policies. It's pretty tough to defend the fact that the average homicide suspect in our nation's capital has been arrested 11 times before. It's pretty hard to defend the massive rise on crime we've seen in Washington, D.C. over the last 4 years, after in 2020, the D.C. City Council and the mayor cut the budget for the law enforcement officers in our nation's capital. So it's not surprising to me that only one Democrat on this committee showed up. It's partisan because we see Democrats and the radical left have driven through soft on crime policies, and what we've seen here is the empirical data of what happens when you do that. And you combine that with the anti-police rhetoric from those on the left that we documented here today, shared by Mr. Pemberton, what the impact is on the morale of law enforcement officers and how hard it is to recruit men and women to join the law enforcement community, to put a badge over their heart, to walk out the door every day, not knowing what the call will be, but knowing that they're going to answer the call on all of our behalf. And everyone, visitors, staff members, members of Congress, have a right to feel safe in our nation's capital. And right now, far too many don't feel safe. And they don't feel safe because of the policies put forward by liberals in the D.C. City Council that have allowed crime to spike in our nation's capital. And as chairman on the Committee on House Administration, I can tell you I'm committed to making sure that you, Chief Major, have the resources that you need to be able to do your job and to be able to make sure that we continue to put pressure and pass laws as we have to overturn soft on crime policies in our nation's capital. We've been successful once. We've been vetoed by the President of the United States another time. But we're going to continue our efforts to make sure that everyone, visitors, staff members, members alike, are safe here in our nation's capital. And I want to, on behalf of, I think, of all the members who showed up, I want to say thank you to the law enforcement officers of the Metropolitan Police Department, the men and women of the U.S. Capitol Police who are out there every day, whose jobs are darn hard, in particular darn hard because of the policies and the soft on crime policies that have been advocated by this City Council. So I'll pause there and I'll just once again thank our witnesses for appearing before us today. Your comments were very helpful. The members of the committee may have some additional questions for you, and we ask that you please respond to those questions in writing. Without objection, each member will have 5 legislative days to assert additional materials in the record or to revise and extend their remarks. Now, pursuant to paragraph C of Rule 14 of the Rules of the Committee, I will hereby appoint March Bell as parliamentarian of the Committee on the House Administration and Thomas Lane as assistant parliamentarian on the Committee of House Administration. In addition, pursuant to paragraph B of Rule 14, I hereby appoint Anne Marie Cake as Deputy Clerk of the Committee on House Administration. Without objection, letters announcing both appointments will be placed in the record, and a copy of these letters will be available to all committee members. There being no further business, I want to thank the members for their participation. And without objection, the committee stands adjourned.